They say the first slap never really lands on the skin. It lands somewhere deeper, in the space between disbelief and shame. I still remember the sound, that soft, wet crack against my cheek, followed by the silence that swallowed the entire kitchen. She said it right after, with that steady voice she used when she wanted to make herself the victim. "It was an accident, Mama. You startled me." The word "Mama" was the cruelest part. She used it like a blade dipped in sugar. "My name is Elena. I'm 73, and that slap was the first time anyone had hit me since my husband died 30 years ago. But what I remember most is not the pain. It's how small the world suddenly became. One moment I was standing beside the stove, folding towels warm from the dryer, and the next I was somewhere else entirely, inside the stunned body of an old woman who didn't know how to defend herself anymore. I had been living with my son Tomas and his wife Sabrina for almost a year by then. They said it was temporary, just until my hip healed, until I got stronger, until I could manage alone again. I had believed them. Of course I had. That's what mothers do. They believe their children when they promise safety. The house itself was too big for them, a new 2-story thing in a neighborhood that smelled of cut grass and polite conversations. They liked the symmetry of it, the clean white walls, the quiet. It was the kind of house where you lower your voice without knowing why. I kept my things neat and small, a single suitcase, my old radio, a photograph of my husband, Luis. Everything else stayed in boxes in a storage unit across town. Sabrina said it looked cluttered when I tried to hang my framed cross-stitch over the dining table, so I didn't. I learned to shrink my presence until I could almost forget I existed. The day she hit me started the way so many days do in houses that look happy from the outside. Nothing special, nothing sharp, just routine. I was ironing a kitchen towel while the baby monitor hummed on the counter. Sabrina was on the phone with her sister, walking back and forth between the living room and the patio. She had this habit of multitasking anger. She could complain and chop vegetables at the same time, moving her knife fast and precise. I had been careful not to cross her path, but then the vase slipped. It was a blue glass one, cheap, nothing sentimental, but it shattered in that theatrical way glass does when it senses tension in the air. She turned so quickly I barely saw her hand rise. The slap was sudden, and then the apology came too fast, like something rehearsed. She said she'd been startled, said she'd been thinking of something else. Her eyes didn't look sorry. They looked triumphant, almost relieved, as if she'd finally expressed something she'd been holding back for months. When Tomas came home that evening, she cried before I could speak. She told him she'd been tired, that her nerves were shot, that it had all been a misunderstanding. He looked at me the way men look at evidence they wish didn't exist, and said, "Mom, you know how she gets when she's overwhelmed. Just let it go." Let it go, as if silence were some noble act of peace. I said I was fine. I said it because that's what you learn to say when the people you love want you to disappear quietly into forgiveness. After he left the room, I stood at the sink for a long time, rubbing my cheek with the back of my hand. The skin was barely red. It would fade. The silence wouldn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I could hear them through the thin wall between my room and theirs, her voice low and tremulous, his full of weary comfort. I imagined him rubbing her shoulders, telling her everything would be all right, that his mother was just sensitive, that maybe I'd misunderstood. I wanted to laugh, but the sound stayed trapped behind my teeth. I stared at the ceiling until the shadows started to move like slow waves. I thought about all the women I'd known who stayed silent after the first act of cruelty, how they turned that silence into furniture, something that fit into the house, something that didn't make noise. In the morning, she made coffee as if nothing had happened. She even asked me how I slept. I said, well, because I was raised to keep the peace even when it tastes like blood. She smiled, that wide, television-perfect smile, and said, good, Mama. We need a calm house today. That word again. Mama. The word that used to mean tenderness had become her way of saying, know your place. I watched her hands as she stirred the cup, elegant hands with nails always painted pale pink. I had worked my whole life with hands that never looked like that, hands that cleaned, cooked, carried. I wondered when my son started thinking those hands were something to be embarrassed by. Tomas kissed her on the forehead before leaving for work. He didn't look at me. He used to call me every day when he first moved out after college, telling me what he'd cooked, what bill he'd finally paid, how much he missed home. Now our conversations were logistics, prescriptions, schedules, reminders. He'd become a polite stranger in his own story, a man who said, thanks, Mom, the way people say thank you to the cashier. I told myself he was busy, that he loved me just differently now. That's the dangerous lie aging women tell themselves, that neglect is just another form of respect. The cheek healed within a day, but something inside me didn't. I found myself flinching when she walked too close behind me. When the doorbell rang, I checked if my face still looked normal, as if someone could see the truth just by glancing. I kept the incident folded inside me like a secret photograph, proof of a moment that no one else would believe. Sometimes, when I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair, I'd catch the faintest trace of the bruise and feel both shame and relief. Shame, because it meant I'd let it happen. Relief, because it meant I hadn't imagined it. A week later, she bought me a new vase. The same shade of blue, only thinner, more fragile. She placed it on the same shelf and smiled as if nothing had ever broken there. I wanted to throw it against the wall, but I didn't. Instead, I dusted it carefully every morning, afraid that another accident would turn me into the villain. That's the curse of women like me. We are taught that survival means being agreeable, even in the face of humiliation. I told myself it was easier this way, easier to pretend. But pretending has its own sound. It's the sound of footsteps slowing in a hallway because you're afraid to be seen. It's the sound of your own voice disappearing from conversation. It's the way your body curls smaller on the edge of a bed that isn't yours. Every evening, I would listen to the house settling around me, the pipes sighing, the clock ticking, and I'd think of Luis. He was not a perfect man, but he had never once raised his hand to me. We fought, of course, over money, over my stubbornness, over the years that slipped too fast, but we never crossed that line. When he died, I promised myself I would never live in fear again. And yet there I was, 73, afraid of a woman half my age. Sometimes I think the most painful part wasn't the slap itself, but the moment after, when I realized no one would believe it happened. Old women bruise easily, they'd say. She probably startled her daughter-in-law. These are the quiet verdicts people hand down to us, the soft sentences that erase our truth. That night, when I turned off the light, I whispered aloud just to hear the sound of my own voice. You're still here. It sounded strange, like something I hadn't said in a long time. I kept saying it again and again until the dark stopped feeling like a witness and started feeling like a promise. It happened again, only this time there was no accident to hide behind, no excuse that could fit neatly into the silence of our house. It was early September, the air thick and wet from rain, and I had been folding laundry in the small utility room when I heard the shouting begin. Sabrina's voice came sharp through the door. that clipped sing-song tone she used when she wanted to sound calm but was already boiling. I stepped into the hallway and saw her standing over the dining table, one hand on her hip, the other waving a broken piece of porcelain like a weapon. The blue vase again, the one she had replaced after the first time. It lay shattered on the floor, its fragments glittering like ice under the window light. "Do you see what you've done?" she said, her voice cracking in mock disbelief. "You just can't help yourself, can you? Always making a mess." I opened my mouth to speak, to tell her I hadn't even been near the table, that I had been in the other room, but the words felt heavy, clumsy, out of place in her perfect kitchen. I told her calmly that it must have been the draft from the open window. She didn't answer right away. She stared at me as if I had confessed to something far worse, then stepped closer until I could smell her perfume. Sweet, synthetic, expensive. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she whispered. I wanted to walk away. I should have. But I stood there, frozen between pride and disbelief, between the need to protect myself and the need not to anger her. It's strange how quickly you forget the lessons of youth, the ones about dignity and self-respect when you live in someone else's home. She moved closer, her eyes narrow, her lips trembling in that dramatic way people use when they want witnesses to feel sorry for them. "I'm tired of you ruining everything," she said, and then she did it again. The slap was faster, harder, deliberate. There was no shock this time, no apology, no claim of accident, only the sound of it echoing through the tiled kitchen and the taste of iron at the back of my throat. I remember thinking, almost absurdly, that the vase wasn't the only thing that had broken. Something in me cracked too, something invisible but vital. She looked at me, breathing hard, and for a moment we were both still. Then she bent down, picked up a shard of glass and whispered, "You see what you make me do?" When Tomas came home, the scene was perfectly staged. She had cleaned the floor, poured herself a glass of wine, and arranged her features into that delicate mixture of exhaustion and innocence that men mistake for fragility. I sat at the kitchen table, the bruise under my cheekbone pulsing quietly, and waited. He noticed the tension instantly. He always did, but he had trained himself to interpret it as something else. Fatigue, misunderstanding, the clash of personalities. "Everything okay?" he asked, setting his briefcase down. Sabrina smiled at him with her carefully practiced calm. "Your mother broke another vase," she said lightly, as if announcing the weather. "It's not a big deal, but she got upset when I mentioned it. You know how she takes things personally." He turned to me, his eyes already half on her, half on me, the way a man looks when he's searching for the quickest exit from responsibility. "Mom?" he asked softly. I could have told him the truth right then. I could have said, "She hit me again." But the words wouldn't come. I saw how tired he was, the dark half-moons under his eyes, the gentle slump of his shoulders. He wanted peace, not truth, and I was too afraid to become the storm. So I said, "It's fine. It was just an accident." I don't know if he believed me or if he simply chose to. He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, relief flickering across his face, and said, "Good. Let's just move on, okay? We're all under stress." Sabrina turned away to hide her smile, and I understood finally that this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was control. She wanted to make sure I knew my place, that my word meant nothing if hers contradicted it. That night, I went to my room and locked the door for the first time. I sat on the edge of the bed with my hands shaking in my lap, the skin of my cheek still tender, and stared at the reflection of myself in the small mirror above the dresser. My face looked like someone else's, older, harder, a stranger's. I pressed my fingers to the bruise and whispered, "You said nothing." The silence was unbearable. I didn't sleep that night. I heard them talking in the living room, low voices rising now and then, his attempts at reason, her soft sobs, the sound of comfort that belonged to her and not to me. Around midnight, I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water and found the pieces of the vase in the trash, neatly wrapped in paper towels, as if the whole thing had never happened. I stared at that bundle of broken glass and thought about how easy it was to erase a story when only one person was willing to tell it. I thought of all the women in my mother's generation who never said a word about their bruises, who called it bad luck or carelessness, who told their daughters to be patient, to avoid making trouble. I had promised myself I would never be like them. And yet there I was, whispering apologies to a woman who had struck me. The next morning, Sabrina served breakfast like nothing had happened. She asked if I wanted toast, her voice light, casual, friendly, and I realized she was giving me a script. If I accepted her civility, if I answered gently, it would mean the world outside her kitchen would never know what she had done. So I took the toast, said thank you, and chewed in silence. My son kissed her on the cheek before leaving for work. I watched the gesture, so small, so ordinary, and felt the ache of something final. The house was no longer home. It was a theater of politeness built over fear. That day, I started noticing the subtler ways she erased me. She moved my chair at the table slightly farther from the center. She began addressing me less directly, speaking about me instead of to me, as though I were a hired hand or an inconvenient guest. When the neighbors visited, she introduced me as Tomas's mother, staying with us for a little while. Never Elena, never the woman who had raised him, who had cleaned his scraped knees and worked double shifts to pay for his education. I became a temporary object in my own son's narrative, something to be tolerated until it could be relocated. The catalyst was not the slap itself, but what followed. The quiet conspiracy of denial, the rewriting of facts, the casual cruelty of omission. Each gesture, each silence, added a new layer to the realization that I was no longer safe in my son's house. That evening, as I watered the plants on the balcony, I overheard them arguing again, this time about me. Sabrina's voice came sharp through the open window. "She makes me uncomfortable, Tomas. She watches me. She judges everything I do." He sighed. "She's just old-fashioned. Please, try to understand." "I have tried," she snapped, "but I can't live like this, not with her shadow in every room." I froze. Her shadow, that's what I was to her. Something that reminded her of the humanity she couldn't bear to see. And Tomas, my sweet boy who once hid behind my legs during thunderstorms, now spoke of me like a problem to be managed. "I'll talk to her," he said softly. "We'll figure something out." That night he knocked on my door, his face carefully composed. He sat on the edge of the bed like a doctor about to deliver bad news. "Mom," he began, "I think maybe it's time you start thinking about your own space again, somewhere close so we can visit all the time. Sabrina's worried about your health, and the stairs here aren't safe. Maybe an apartment or an assisted place. I can help with the paperwork." I looked at him and saw not malice, but fear, the kind of fear that makes good people weak. He wanted to protect his life from conflict, even if it meant abandoning the truth. I said nothing. I nodded slowly and told him I'd think about it. When he left, I closed the door and finally let myself cry. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the deep, hollow kind that comes when you realize the person you love most in the world has chosen someone else's comfort over your pain. It wasn't just a slap anymore. It was the sound of a life closing in, of an old woman realizing that silence was no longer dignity, it was complicity. The next morning, when I looked in the mirror, the bruise had turned a soft yellow, fading like memory, but inside something was beginning to harden. I didn't know it yet, but that was the day I started to prepare for what would come next. The quiet, deliberate act of recording what the world refused to see. After that conversation about finding my own space, the air in the house began to change in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like the slow dimming of light before a storm. I woke each morning to the sound of the coffee machine hissing and Sabrina's voice low on the phone, her tone sweet but brittle, a rehearsed melody meant for outsiders. She had begun to make small adjustments to the rhythm of the house, subtle, strategic, nearly invisible to someone who didn't live inside her patterns. The towels I had folded would be refolded. My cup, always placed near the window, would be moved to the back of the cupboard. My laundry, once a quiet routine, was now a shared schedule pinned to the refrigerator, with my name written in smaller, lighter letters than everyone else's. She never said anything cruel directly anymore. She didn't have to. The small rearrangements of my existence were enough to make me understand that I was an intruder. Tomas pretended not to notice. He left early for work, came home late, kissed her on the cheek, and asked about the baby before retreating to his office upstairs. He thought peace was a form of love, that avoiding conflict meant protecting the people he cared for. I could see the way he looked at her, half tenderness, half exhaustion, the look of a man trapped between two loyalties he didn't have the courage to reconcile. I didn't blame him entirely. I blamed time, which turned sons into diplomats and mothers into relics. But what hurt most was not his silence. It was his easy acceptance of hers, the way he had begun to believe her version of things without even realizing it. I began to stay mostly in my room, a narrow space with a small window that overlooked the side yard and a line of bare trees. I spent my mornings listening to the radio, pretending the voices of strangers were company. The room was always cold, even when the heater was on, as if the warmth knew it wasn't welcome there. Sometimes I heard Sabrina moving around in the hallway, her heels clicking softly, her voice murmuring to the baby or to someone on speakerphone. She laughed often now, a sharp, rehearsed laugh that made the walls vibrate. I wondered if she was laughing about me. Once I came out of my room to find her standing by the baby's crib, whispering something I couldn't hear. When she saw me, she smiled too brightly and said, "He cries every time you hold him. I think you make him nervous." I didn't answer, but the words settled in me like dust, and no matter how much I tried to brush them off, they stayed. Weeks passed like that, slow and colorless. I started keeping notes in a small notebook I hid inside the drawer of my nightstand. I wrote about the temperature of the house, the meals we ate, the things she said under her breath when she thought I wasn't listening. At first, it was just a way to stay sane, a form of confession with no priest to hear it. But soon, it became something else, a record of small erasures, the chipped mug thrown away without mention, the family photos rearranged so my face was turned toward the wall, the birthday card from my friend that vanished from the mantelpiece. I knew what she was doing, and she knew that I knew. That silent knowledge was our secret war. When people visited, she played her part with delicate precision. She would ask about their children, offer them slices of cake, and smile just enough to look generous. I sat quietly, always slightly out of the circle, and watched her perform kindness like a language she had memorized phonetically. Once, one of her friends, a young woman with perfect hair and too much perfume, asked me how it felt to live with my family at this stage of life. The phrasing stung. This stage. as if old age were an illness that required containment. Sabrina answered before I could. "It's been a blessing," she said, placing her hand gently on my shoulder. "She's such a help around the house." Her touch was light, almost affectionate, but I could feel the warning underneath. I smiled for the guest's sake, though my teeth felt heavy in my mouth. Later that night, I went to the bathroom and stared at the mirror until my reflection blurred. I whispered, "You're not a guest," just to hear the words out loud, but they sounded unconvincing even to me. Tomas never saw these moments, or maybe he didn't want to. He would ask me if I was comfortable, if the food was good, if I needed anything. I always said I was fine. I didn't want to burden him with the truth, because the truth would demand something of him, and I had already seen how far he would go to avoid choosing. He still kissed me goodnight, still called me Mama, but there was a new formality in the way he said it, a tone that belonged to a man speaking to a tenant, not a mother. Once, I caught him and Sabrina whispering in the kitchen about plans for next spring. I knew without asking that those plans did not include me. As winter settled in, the tension thickened. The house seemed quieter, not in a peaceful way, but in the way of a place where sound is rationed. Sabrina began keeping the baby's monitor turned up loud, claiming it helped her sleep, but I suspected it was so she could hear if I ever moved around at night. She accused me once, gently, of entering the nursery while the baby was asleep. "I just worry," she said. "Sometimes you forget things. It's normal at your age." The implication was clear. She was planting doubt like a gardener. That night, I checked my purse to make sure I still had my ID, my bank card, my small stash of cash, proof that I was still someone who existed in the world. I stopped eating dinner with them. I told them I wasn't hungry, that my stomach was delicate, but the truth was that sitting at that table felt like being dissected under a soft light. Sabrina would ask me questions designed to wound, questions that looked polite on the surface, but carried hidden barbs. "Do you miss your old house?" she asked once, smiling sweetly. "It must be strange not having your own space anymore." I answered that I was grateful to be with family. She laughed softly, like someone who had won a bet. Around that time, I began to notice how much Sabrina watched her own reflection. She would check herself in the mirror every time she passed by, smoothing her hair, adjusting her blouse, studying her face for signs of imperfection. It was like watching a person build a mask in real time. And Tomas, he adored that mask. He saw it as grace, as composure, as proof that his wife was holding everything together. He didn't see how brittle it was, how easily it cracked when she thought no one was looking. Once, I saw her staring at the baby with a strange, detached expression, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. It frightened me in a way I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I returned from a short walk and found my door slightly open. My drawer, the one with my notebook, had been pulled out just enough for me to notice. I flipped through the pages quickly. Nothing seemed missing, but the air felt wrong, touched. At dinner that night, Sabrina mentioned casually, "I was cleaning your room earlier. You should really lock your drawers if you keep private things. We wouldn't want them to get lost." Her tone was mild, her eyes sharp. I said nothing, but later I moved the notebook into my purse, keeping it close like a fragile heart. That was when I began to write not just observations, but memories, things I was afraid would disappear if I didn't put them down. The sound of Luis's laughter, the smell of my garden in spring, the way my son used to run to me after school. The more she tried to erase me, the more I wrote. Words became my rebellion, my quiet proof of life. By February, I had learned to anticipate her moods the way sailors anticipate storms. The shift in her posture, the tightness in her jaw, the quiet before the cruelty. Sometimes she didn't need to say anything at all. A single look was enough to make me retreat to my room. She had turned the house into a chessboard, and I had become the piece she moved with her silence. I started taking longer walks, wandering through the neighborhood until dusk, just to breathe air that didn't belong to her. I talked to no one, but the simple act of being unseen felt like freedom. One evening, as I came home, I paused outside before entering. Through the window, I could see the warm glow of the dining room, the three of them together, Tomas feeding the baby, Sabrina pouring wine, the picture of a perfect family. I stood there for a long time, watching through the glass like someone looking into a life that had already excluded her. The streetlight flickered above me, and I realized I was trembling, not from cold, but from a kind of quiet understanding. They would never ask me to leave. They would make me want to. That was Sabrina's way. Not force, not open cruelty, but slow displacement, the art of making someone erase herself. That night, I dreamed of my old house, the kitchen yellow with sunlight, the smell of soap and bread, the radio murmuring in the background. When I woke, the morning light in this house felt pale and artificial, like something borrowed. I sat by the window with my coffee and opened my notebook. For the first time, I didn't write about her. I wrote about me, about the small, stubborn pulse that refused to disappear. And though I didn't know it yet, that act, the decision to keep recording, to preserve the truth no matter how small, was the beginning of my escape, the quiet rebellion that would one day become my voice. It was a late afternoon in March when the silence in that house finally began to turn into something I could no longer live with. The snow had melted into a dull gray slush that clung to the pavement, and the days were starting to stretch again, long and hesitant, as if even the sun was unsure about returning. I had spent most of that winter inside, moving through rooms like a ghost who remembered too much. My hip had healed by then, though no one seemed to notice. I had become unnecessary, even to my own recovery. But something had started shifting, quietly, somewhere deep beneath the surface of my fear. It wasn't courage yet. It was more like exhaustion, a tiredness so complete that it began to feel like honesty. One afternoon, as I stood by the window folding baby clothes, I heard Sabrina's voice again, rising from the living room. There was that familiar strain in it, a vibration that made me stop breathing. Only this time, she wasn't speaking to me. She was speaking to the boy. Mateo was 6, small for his age, with the kind of cautious sweetness children develop when they learn early that the world can turn without warning. I had always been careful around him, soft in my voice, gentle in my movements, because I knew he lived under the same quiet rule I did. Don't make her angry. But that day, he must have forgotten. I heard something fall, a cup maybe, and then Sabrina's voice, sharp and cold. "Do you ever listen?" she said. "You're just like your grandmother." The sentence froze me where I stood. Then came the sound I knew too well, the quick slap of skin against skin, followed by his thin, startled cry. I didn't think. My body moved before my mind did. I was in the doorway within seconds, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own breath. She turned toward me, her face flushed, her hand still raised, as if time had caught her in the act and refused to let go. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The boy stood trembling beside the broken cup, his eyes darting between us, trying to decide which version of the truth to believe. I crossed the room slowly and knelt beside him. "It's okay," I said, keeping my voice calm, though my throat was tight. "Go to your room, sweetheart." He hesitated until I looked him in the eye and nodded. Only then did he run down the hall, small footsteps fading into silence. When I straightened up, Sabrina was watching me with that same expression she had worn the day she first hit me, something between fury and relief. "You don't get to interfere," she said. "You don't get to undermine me in my own home." I wanted to tell her it wasn't her home, that my name had helped buy it, that her cruelty didn't make her strong, but I didn't. I just looked at her for a long, steady moment and said, "He's a child." The words sounded simple, but they felt like a crack opening in the wall we had built around our hatred. She walked past me then, brushing against my shoulder, and hissed, "You've always wanted to turn him against me. You think you're the saint here, but you're the poison." She slammed the door to her bedroom, leaving me standing there in the echo of her words. I went to my room, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to press them together to keep still. It wasn't fear anymore. It was something heavier, older, like the weight of every apology I'd ever given to keep peace. I realized, sitting there, that she was never going to stop. And Tomas, my gentle, cowardly boy, would never make her. The only one who could end it was me, and I didn't yet know how. That night, when the house had gone quiet, I opened the drawer of my nightstand and took out my notebook. I reread the pages, the small, cramped handwriting that had become a map of my captivity. The entries were full of dates, details, small humiliations, but for the first time, I wondered if they could be more than a record of my endurance. Maybe they could be proof. The thought frightened me. Proof was dangerous. It meant turning my private suffering into something visible, something that demanded judgment. But the sound of Mateo's cry still echoed in my chest, and I knew that if I stayed silent again, I would never forgive myself. The next morning, I left the house early, before either of them was awake. The air was cold enough to sting, but the sunlight was clear, sharp, alive. I walked to a small electronics shop near the bus stop, the kind of place that sold secondhand phones and dusty appliances. The man behind the counter barely looked up when I entered. I told him I needed a voice recorder, something simple, easy to hide. He asked if it was for interviews, and I said yes, though the lie felt sour on my tongue. He handed me a small device, no bigger than a pack of gum, and showed me how to turn it on and off. I paid in cash, tucked it into my coat pocket, and walked home, feeling both terrified and awake in a way I hadn't felt in years. For days after that, I carried the recorder with me everywhere. At first, I didn't have the courage to use it. I would hold it in my pocket, thumb hovering over the switch, and imagine the moment she'd give me reason to press it. And she always did. The opportunity came faster than I expected. One afternoon, while she was on the phone, I heard her mention me, her voice low and venomous, dripping with contempt. "She's losing it," she said to whoever was on the other end. "I think she's getting confused. Sometimes I worry about leaving her alone with Mateo. She could forget the stove on or something." I stood just outside the doorway, my hand gripping the recorder inside my pocket. I pressed the button. The faint click was swallowed by her words. I don't remember breathing while she spoke. She went on for several minutes, describing me like a problem to be solved, a liability to be managed. When she hung up, I turned the recorder off and slipped it back into my pocket, my pulse thudding in my ears. That night, I listened to it in my room with my headphones on, the sound tinny but clear enough. Hearing her voice detached from her face made me realize how deliberate she was. There was no heat in her cruelty, no impulsive anger. It was calculated, almost professional. I sat there for a long time, staring at the small, glowing light on the recorder, and thought, now I have her. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like stepping into a different kind of danger, because proof is only as strong as the person willing to use it, and I didn't yet know if I was brave enough. In the days that followed, I began to record more. I caught snippets of her scolding the boy, her sharp tone when she thought no one could hear. I recorded her talking to Tomas about me, weaving her web of worry and manipulation. "She needs supervision," she said one evening. "Maybe we should look into assisted living. It would be safer for everyone." My son's voice, soft and uncertain, replied, "I don't know, Sabrina. It feels cruel." She sighed dramatically. Cruel would be letting her hurt herself or him. I stopped listening after that, afraid I'd start screaming if I didn't. I pressed stop and set the recorder down, staring at it like it was a living thing. But even as I gathered these fragments of her voice, part of me still hesitated. There's a strange loyalty that lives inside fear, a need to protect even the people who hurt you, just to preserve the illusion that the world still makes sense. I told myself that if I could just endure a little longer, maybe something would change. Maybe Tomas would wake up. Maybe Sabrina would soften. Maybe the house would remember kindness. But then I'd hear Mateo flinch when she raised her voice, and I'd know none of that was true. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, I found myself sitting on the floor of my room, the recorder in one hand, my notebook in the other. I looked at the two of them together, the sound and the word, the invisible and the visible, and I understood that I had built a kind of truth that could not be erased. For months she had taken pieces of my life, my dignity, my sense of belonging, and now I was taking them back, one recording at a time. It wasn't revenge, it was preservation, a quiet, deliberate act of survival. I didn't tell anyone, not my son, not the neighbors, not even the friend I sometimes called on Sundays. I carried the recorder in my pocket like a secret heartbeat, and each time it clicked on, I felt the smallest surge of power. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The house still belonged to her in all the visible ways, the way she controlled the light, the conversation, the narrative. But now something unseen belonged to me. For the first time in months, I started to feel the faint outline of a future, something past the narrow walls of that house. I began to imagine the sound of a door closing behind me, of footsteps on a different floor, of my own breath steady and unafraid. That was the midpoint, though I didn't know it then, the moment when fear stopped being the only language I spoke. I wasn't free yet, but I had started to remember what freedom sounded like. It was the click of a recorder, the rustle of notebook pages, the voice of a woman who refused to disappear quietly. The spring passed quietly at first, or maybe I should say deceptively, because peace in that house always arrived dressed as pretense. The tulips Sabrina had planted by the driveway bloomed early, their colors almost absurdly bright against the gray siding. She would stand outside with her coffee every morning, taking pictures for her online friends, adjusting her posture until she looked effortlessly happy. Tomas would leave for work with his briefcase, kiss her cheek, and thank her for the breakfast she had ordered in rather than made. I would watch them from the kitchen window and imagine the sound of a world where my presence wasn't a shadow trailing behind them. There was a faint hope in me that maybe things would calm down, that maybe she had exhausted her appetite for cruelty, but I should have known better. Cruelty doesn't rest. It learns new languages, and her latest one was control disguised as concern. It began subtly, the way all her punishments did. One morning, my medication box disappeared from the counter. I searched the cupboards, the drawers, even my laundry basket, but it was gone. When I asked Sabrina if she had seen it, she smiled kindly and said she had put it away for safety. "You keep forgetting to close the lid, Mama," she said, that word, Mama, again, twisting the air between us. "We can't have Mateo finding your pills." "You wouldn't want that, would you?" I nodded, because what else could I do? but something inside me shifted again, that familiar blend of humiliation and disbelief. My pills were my independence, my proof of competence, and now even that was something she decided I could or couldn't touch. I started marking the doses in my notebook each day to make sure she hadn't tampered with them. Later, I would discover she had replaced one bottle entirely with multivitamins, perhaps to make me doubt my own memory. It was a small thing, easily dismissed if spoken aloud, but these small things, when stacked, became a tower of quiet madness. Tomas noticed none of it, or pretended not to. He had become distant in the way men become distant when home turns into a battlefield they cannot control. He came home later each evening, exhausted, his mind already elsewhere. Sometimes he sat with the boy to read, and for those few moments, the house almost felt human again. But then Sabrina would enter the room, her voice soft but commanding, and the fragile balance would collapse. I could feel her watching me during dinner, testing how far she could push. Once, when I mentioned that the soup tasted salty, she smiled and said, "Oh dear, maybe your taste buds are going." That happens, doesn't it? I forced a small laugh to keep the peace, but later I spat the taste of it into the sink and whispered, "I still know the difference between salt and spite." By May, my recordings had become an obsession. The little device had started to feel like an extension of my body, a heartbeat I could control. Each night, I would listen to snippets in my room, cataloging moments of manipulation, like evidence in an invisible trial. Her voice filled my ears, condescending, practiced, persuasive. Once, she spoke to her friend over the phone saying, "She's slipping. I'm keeping an eye on her, but it's only a matter of time before Tomas has to make a decision." That sentence, "make a decision," stayed with me. It was the kind of phrase people use when they want something terrible to sound reasonable. The next escalation came not from her, but from the boy. Mateo had started wetting the bed again. He was quiet about it, always stripping the sheets early, trying to hide them before she saw. I noticed the smell one morning while folding laundry and asked gently if he was okay. He nodded, his face pale, and whispered, "Mom says I'm bad." I felt my throat tighten. "You're not bad," I told him, crouching down so we were eye level. "You just had a little accident." He shook his head, his small hands gripping the fabric of his pajama sleeve. "She gets mad when I say it's an accident." His words came like small stones thrown into a still pond, each one rippling into a truth too heavy to carry. That night, I placed the recorder on the top shelf of the hall closet, facing his room. It was risky, but I needed more than my word now. I needed the sound of what she was doing to him. 2 nights later, it happened. I woke to the sound of raised voices, muffled at first, then sharp. The recorder's red light blinked in the dark like an eye watching everything unfold. I opened my door just enough to see down the hallway. Mateo stood in the doorway of his room, crying, his small body trembling. Sabrina's voice was low but hard as stone. "You disgust me," she said. "You think this is cute? Making me clean up after you like some servant?" He sobbed, apologizing over and over. I wanted to run to him, to grab him and take him away, but something in me held still, the same something that had kept me silent after her slap. But this time it wasn't fear. It was strategy. I knew that what I needed now wasn't a reaction. It was proof. She struck him once, a sharp sound that tore through the air. He didn't scream, only whimpered softly like a small wounded thing. Then she left the room, slamming the door behind her, muttering, "You're just like her." I waited until I was sure she had gone to bed, then slipped down the hall and opened the boy's door. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, holding his knees, his eyes wide and unfocused. When he saw me, he didn't cry again. He just whispered, "Don't tell." I sat beside him, brushed his hair back, and said, "I won't tell her, but I will tell someone who can help." He looked confused, then scared, so I added softly, "You did nothing wrong. Remember that." He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I stayed there until he fell asleep, then went to my room and retrieved the recorder. My hands were shaking as I replayed the sound. Every second of it was clear. Her voice, his crying, the slap, proof. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the table waiting for Tomas. When he came down, tie in hand, eyes bleary, I said, "We need to talk." He froze, sensing the tone. Sabrina appeared in the doorway moments later, dressed impeccably as always, her expression alert. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice dripping false concern. I looked directly at her and said, "You hit the boy last night." Her face went blank, then soft with practiced confusion. "What are you talking about?" She laughed lightly. "You must have dreamed it. You've been hearing things lately." I didn't answer. I reached into my sweater pocket, took out the recorder, and placed it on the table. "Listen," I said. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Thomas stepped forward, his brow furrowing. I pressed play. The room filled with the small, tinny sounds of their private cruelty, her voice sharp and undeniable, Mateo's crying. She tried to speak over it, her words frantic, but the sound swallowed her excuses whole. When it ended, Tomas just stood there, pale, motionless. He looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, the image of his perfect wife splintering in real time. "You did this?" he whispered. She shook her head, tears welling instantly. "It's not what it sounds like," she said. "You know how recordings can be twisted." He turned to me, his eyes searching. "Is this real?" The question cut deeper than anything she had ever said. I nodded slowly. "Yes, and it's not the first time." He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. She tried to reach for him, but he pulled away. "You hid our son," he said quietly, disbelief cracking his voice. "You hit my mother." Her composure crumbled. She began to cry, loud, heaving sobs, meant to fill the space with pity. "I'm overwhelmed," she gasped. "I've been doing everything alone. You never help." I just snapped. I watched him struggle with the choice between compassion and truth, the choice that had always undone him. Finally, he stood and said, "You need to leave the house for a while. Take a few days. We'll talk after." It was not enough, but it was something. When she packed her things later that day, she avoided my eyes. Mateo clung to my leg, silent. Tomas followed her to the car, and I stayed inside, afraid that if I saw her drive away, I might not believe it was real. That evening, for the first time in months, the house was quiet. Too quiet. I made tea, the kind Luis used to like, and sat by the window, the recorder on the table beside me. It looked small, insignificant, and yet it had changed everything. But peace did not last. 2 days later, Tomas received a call from her lawyer. She had told him that I was manipulative, that I had fabricated the evidence, that I was unstable. He looked at me with hollow eyes, torn between what he had heard and what he had always been taught to believe. "She says you've been recording her for months," he said. I nodded. "I have." "She says you threatened her." I laughed softly, not from humor, but disbelief. "She's trying to rewrite the story again." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "She wants custody of Mateo." The words landed like a blow. After what she did? He didn't answer. The following week became a blur of calls, meetings, and tension so thick it felt like the house itself might burst. Child services came. They interviewed me, then Mateo, then Tomas. The boy told the truth in a small, trembling voice, his hands twisting in his lap. When the social worker asked if he felt safe with his mother, he whispered, "Sometimes. Not when she's mad." That was enough. They opened an investigation. She moved into her sister's apartment across town. Tomas stopped sleeping. He wandered the house at night, guilt shadowing his every step. Once, I found him sitting on the couch in the dark, holding the recorder. "I keep listening," he said. "I can't believe I didn't see it." I wanted to comfort him, but I couldn't find the right words. Some truths don't heal. They simply settle in like weather. As weeks passed, I began to realize how much damage silence had done. If I had spoken sooner, maybe Mateo wouldn't have learned fear so young. Maybe Tomas would have seen the truth before it had to be proven with sound. But regret is a cruel companion. It offers no redemption, only hindsight. I started taking Mateo to the park in the afternoons. He ran, laughed, stumbled, and looked at me sometimes as if testing whether joy was still allowed. Slowly, it returned to him, cautious but real. One day he asked, "Are we going to be okay, Grandma?" And I said, "Yes, my love, we already are." The house felt lighter after that, though the shadow of her lingered like perfume that refused to fade. I kept the recorder in a drawer, wrapped in a handkerchief, the same way I once kept my wedding ring after Luis died, not out of attachment, but as a reminder, proof that I had survived something I could no longer explain to anyone who hadn't lived it. Tomas began therapy. Mateo began to sleep through the night, and I began to breathe again without listening for footsteps behind me. I knew she might return one day, that people like her always find a way to come back. But I also knew that this time I would not meet her with silence. Because silence, I learned, is a kind of violence too. It protects the wrong people. It feeds the cruelty it fears. That recorder had not just captured her voice. It had recorded the moment I remembered my own. And from that moment forward, nothing, not her words, not my son's doubts, not the long years of invisibility, could take it from me. The day everything finally broke open was the day the air felt wrong, even before anything happened. It was one of those heavy summer afternoons when the light itself seems exhausted, the sky low and white, pressing down on the roof until it hums. I had been baking bread with Mateo. He loved to help knead the dough, his small hands pushing against mine with such careful effort that I often pretended to let him do all the work. We were laughing quietly when the sound of tires on gravel made me look up. A car door slammed, then another. Through the window, I saw her step out, sunglasses on, hair immaculate, a clipboard pressed to her chest like a weapon. She didn't knock. She walked straight to the door and opened it with the spare key she still had, her presence filling the hallway with a chill that no summer sun could melt. Mateo froze, his hands still covered in flour, and whispered, "Mom." Tomas came down the stairs moments later, his face pale, his movements hesitant, as though he had rehearsed this meeting 100 times and still didn't know his lines. "You shouldn't be here, Sabrina," he said quietly. We agreed to wait until after the hearing. She ignored him, her eyes locked on me. I wiped my hands on a towel and stood my ground. She smiled, that same brittle smile that used to precede her cruelties, and said, "I'm here for my son. You've had him long enough." Tomas stepped between us, his hand trembling slightly as he gestured for calm. "Let's talk about this somewhere else," he said, but she was already moving toward Mateo, her voice rising, sweet and poisonous. "Come on, baby. Pack your things. We're going home." He didn't move. He looked at me instead, his eyes wide, searching for permission. And in that moment, I realized that whatever would happen next would define the rest of our lives. I told him softly, "Stay here, Mateo." My voice didn't shake, though everything inside me did. Sabrina turned sharply. "Don't tell him what to do," she snapped. "You've confused him enough." I could see the fury building under her polished surface, the mask slipping. Tomas reached for her arm, but she jerked it away. "You think you can take him from me? You and your crazy old mother? You've poisoned him against me, both of you." Her words were sharp, desperate, and something in them rang of the truth she'd always hidden, that she was losing control, that her power depended entirely on our silence. "You hit him," I said quietly. The words cut through the air like glass. "You hit your child and called it love." Her face twisted. "You're lying." But I could see it then, the panic behind her eyes, the knowledge that I wasn't afraid of her anymore. "You think anyone will believe you?" she said, her voice lowering into that cold, deliberate tone I remembered. "You're old. You're unstable. You made those recordings, but anyone could hear what they want to hear. You manipulated everyone. You made him pity you." Tomas spoke then, his voice hoarse. "Stop." It was the first time he had ever raised his voice to her, and for a brief second, she looked startled, as if the script she'd memorized had suddenly changed. "We have proof, Sabrina," he said. "They have it. The caseworker heard it. It's over." She shook her head slowly, stepping back, her expression flickering between disbelief and rage. "You're all against me," she whispered. "You'll regret this." Then she turned her gaze back to me, and something inside her broke. "You think you've won? You've destroyed my family." I didn't answer. I was too tired for victory, too aware of the cost. "You did that yourself," I said quietly. All I did was stop pretending. Her hand moved before I could think. The slap landed hard, a sound that seemed to split the air itself. Mateo screamed. Tomas grabbed her wrist before she could move again, his voice shaking with fury. "That's enough." She struggled, cried, twisted, but he held firm. "Get out," he said, his words calm but final. "You're not taking him. You're not coming back here." She stared at him, waiting for him to falter the way he always had. But he didn't. I saw something shift in his face, a kind of awakening, painful and irreversible. The door closed behind her a moment later, and the sound of her car pulling away felt both like an ending and a beginning. Mateo clung to me, crying into my shirt. "She'll come back," he whispered. "No," I said. "Not this time." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't over yet. People like her never leave quietly. They always look for one more performance, one last audience. That evening, after the police came and took statements, after Thomas finally sat down with his head in his hands, I stood in the kitchen, staring at the loaf of bread we'd never finished baking. The dough had risen too much, spilling over the edge of the bowl, its shape ruined, but still alive. I pressed my palm gently against it, feeling the warmth. It reminded me of something my mother used to say when I was little and afraid. You can't unbreak a plate, but you can use the pieces to hold something else. Maybe that's what survival is, learning how to hold what's left. The next days blurred into a series of procedures, calls, and official visits. The social worker confirmed what we all knew, that Mateo would stay with us until the court decided otherwise. Sabrina's lawyer sent letters full of accusations that made my stomach turn. She claimed emotional manipulation, falsified evidence, elder coercion. It was absurd, yet each word carried the sting of possibility, because I knew how easily the world believes the polished voice over the trembling one. But this time, I had something she didn't: consistency. My story didn't change. I handed them the recordings, my notebooks, even the dates of her visits. Tomas testified too, his voice shaking but sure. The judge listened quietly, and when it was done, he said only, "The child remains with his father." When the verdict was read, I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was release, the slow unwinding of months of fear that had lived inside my bones. Sabrina stood at the other end of the courtroom, perfectly composed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, our eyes met. I thought she might scream, but she didn't. She only smiled that same thin smile and whispered something to her lawyer before walking out. I realized then that I no longer needed her apology. I no longer needed her recognition of what she'd done. The truth existed outside of her now, recorded, documented, undeniable. That night, the three of us sat together in the living room. Mateo fell asleep on the couch, his head resting against my leg. Tomas stared at the window for a long time before saying, "I should have listened sooner." His voice was small, heavy. I kept telling myself she just needed time. I didn't want to believe she could be cruel. I reached for his hand. "We see what we want to see until we can't anymore," I said. "You did what you could when you were ready. That's all any of us can do." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mama." I squeezed his hand and said, "Don't be. Just be better now." Later, after he went to bed, I walked through the house alone. The quiet no longer felt like fear. It felt like space. I opened the window and let the night air in. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound of the city hummed faintly, a reminder that life had continued outside our small, poisoned world. On the kitchen table, the recorder still sat where I had left it after the hearing. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and pressed play one last time. Her voice filled the room again, brittle and sharp, but this time I didn't flinch. I listened all the way through, not out of hatred, but to mark the moment it no longer had power over me. When it ended, I opened the back door, stepped into the yard, and set the recorder down on the stone wall. The stars were faint, barely visible through the city's haze, but they were there. I lifted a small hammer from the toolbox Tomas had left by the shed and brought it down once, cleanly. The device cracked in half, the sound oddly satisfying. The fragments glittered under the porch light like the pieces of the vase she'd broken long ago. I stood there for a long time, breathing the night air, feeling the quiet hum of my pulse. The act wasn't about destruction. It was about closure. I didn't need proof anymore. The truth had done its work. It had changed us, forced us into honesty, carved out a small pocket of peace. Inside the house, Mateo stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly, and I knew that, whatever came next, he would grow up knowing that someone had stood up for him when it mattered. I walked back inside, washed the flour from my hands, and turned off the kitchen light. Before bed, I paused by the window, looking at the outline of the street beyond the fence. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. The house felt lighter, as if it had taken a deep breath with me. I whispered into the dark, not as a prayer, but as a declaration to whatever part of myself had stayed hidden all those years. You're still here. And this time, the words didn't sound like a plea. They sounded like truth. The summer turned into autumn quietly, as if the world itself was trying not to disturb what little peace we had managed to build. The days shortened, the evenings came earlier, and the air carried that faint melancholy scent of leaves beginning to dry and fall. The house no longer felt like a cage, though it was still heavy with memory. Some mornings I would wake before dawn and sit by the kitchen window, watching the light unfold slowly over the garden, the sky bruised with soft gray. Mateo would come in rubbing his eyes, always barefoot, always smiling in that cautious way children do when they are still learning that safety can last longer than a moment. He would sit beside me with his bowl of cereal, and we would talk about small things. His school, the squirrel that had stolen a piece of bread from the fence, the toy car he wanted for his birthday. These were simple conversations, but each one felt like a victory, a small, quiet reclaiming of normal life. Tomas had changed too. The weight in his face had lifted, though the guilt still lingered around the corners of his eyes. He spoke less, but listened more. There were times when I caught him watching me and Mateo playing, his expression both tender and remorseful, as though he was trying to measure the distance between the man he had been and the one he was becoming. He went to therapy every week and came home calmer, slower, as if the act of unlearning took effort. He had started cooking again, something he hadn't done in years. His food was clumsy but honest, soups that were too salty, rice that stuck to the pot, and each meal he served us was an apology that didn't need words. We didn't talk about her anymore, not because we had forgotten, but because she no longer deserved space inside our mouths. I often thought about how it all began. The first slap, the first silence, the first time I told myself it was easier to forgive than to fight. There is something strange about survival. It doesn't always feel like strength. Sometimes it feels like a kind of slow erosion, like you have to lose so much of yourself before you finally recognize what's worth saving. I used to believe that dignity was quiet, that being good meant enduring without complaint. I don't believe that anymore. Dignity, I've learned, has a sound. It's the sound of your own voice saying no, even when it shakes. It's the sound of a small recorder clicking on in the dark. It's the sound of a boy finally sleeping through the night because he knows no one will wake him in anger. The neighbors eventually learned parts of the story, as neighbors always do. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with the cautious curiosity people reserve for tragedy that doesn't touch them directly. One woman, an old friend from church, stopped by with a pie and said, "You're so brave." I wanted to tell her that bravery had nothing to do with it, that it was simply exhaustion turned inside out. But instead I smiled and thanked her. The truth is that courage rarely feels like courage when you're in it. It feels like desperation. It feels like trembling. It feels like survival disguised as patience. As the months went on, I found myself writing less in the notebook. The need to document had faded, replaced by something gentler, reflection. When I did write, the entries were no longer about fear or proof. They were about moments, the smell of rain through the open window, the way Mateo's laughter filled the hallway, the warmth of a mug between my palms on a cold morning. Life was beginning to return in fragments, and I took care to notice each one. I think that's what recovery is, not forgetting, but noticing again, allowing small joys to re-enter the body without suspicion. One afternoon in late October, I walked with Mateo to the park near the river. The trees had turned gold, their reflections trembling in the slow water. He ran ahead of me, chasing a red kite that bobbed awkwardly in the wind, and for a moment, as I watched him, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, peace without fear. A woman sitting on a nearby bench smiled and said, "Your grandson?" I nodded. "He looks happy," she said. "You must be proud." I looked at him, his small frame, his laughter, his fierce determination not to let the kite fall, and I said, "I am." But inside, I was thinking of how much that happiness had cost, how many silences had been broken to make room for it, When we got home that evening, Tomas was sitting at the table with an envelope in his hands. It was from the court, finalizing the custody arrangement. Sabrina had signed it without contest. She was living in another city now. We hadn't heard from her in months. There was no satisfaction in it, only relief. I told him to put the papers away, that the past didn't need to sit in plain sight anymore. He folded them neatly, placed them in a drawer, and said, "I still don't know how to thank you." I shook my head. "You don't thank a mother for protecting her family. You just make sure it means something." He looked at me for a long time, then said, "I will." Later that night, after Mateo was asleep, I went outside to the small garden behind the house. The tulips had long since died, leaving behind dry stalks and a faint trace of their once bright color. I knelt by the soil and dug a small hole with my hands, the earth cool and soft. From my pocket, I took out one of the broken pieces of the recorder I had kept, a fragment no bigger than a coin. I buried it there, pressing the soil gently over it. It felt right somehow to leave it in the ground, to let it become something else. Maybe next spring, flowers would grow there again, and no one would know what was beneath them. I stayed outside a long time, listening to the wind rustling through the branches. The world felt vast again, no longer confined to the narrow corridors of that house, no longer haunted by the echo of her voice. I thought of all the women I'd known, neighbors, friends, cousins, who had swallowed their pain until it soured inside them, who had been told that endurance was virtue. I wanted to speak to them all, to tell them that silence isn't peace, that kindness without boundaries is a slow death. But I also knew that some lessons can only be learned the hard way, and some voices, once silenced, can only be reborn through struggle. Before I went back inside, I looked up at the night sky, the first stars faint against the deep blue. I whispered a small prayer, not for forgiveness or for strength, but for clarity, for the courage never to mistake quiet for safety again. And then I spoke to the women who would never hear me, to the ones still sitting in kitchens like I once did, thinking endurance was love. If they call it an accident, write it down. If they say you're exaggerating, press record. If they tell you to keep the peace, remember that peace built on silence is only fear with prettier curtains. Speak, even if your voice trembles, especially then. When I went back inside, the house smelled like soap and bread. Mateo stirred in his sleep, murmuring something soft, and Tomas had left the light on in the hallway so I wouldn't have to walk in the dark. I sat on my bed, the window open to the cool night air, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own life. I felt steady, rooted, alive. I touched the edge of my old notebook, now nearly full, and thought of the next one I might begin. Not a record of harm, but of continuation. Because survival, after all, is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of everything that comes after.